BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. This week,
you had people who were ready to sell their votes. Some of the old hands had been taking millions and they had to leave.
Scandal after scandal, and it needs to come to an end.
Frankly, this has gone on for years now. It's not improving. It's going from bad to worse to worse.
It started out as a charity in Switzerland over 100 years ago and has become one of the most powerful organisations in the world. But now, the governing body for football is in a bad way. So, in the week that FIFA decides whether to re-elect Sepp Blatter as president, we're asking, who can fix FIFA? It's Thursday the 13th of November 2014. The stage is set for high drama. The release of a report summarising a 2-year investigation into allegations of vote buying in the selection of Russia and Qatar to host the next 2 World Cups. Enter stage left Hans-Joachim Eckert, a German judge and FIFA's independent ethics adjudicator. His 40-page report finds no evidence of wrongdoing. FIFA breathes a sigh of relief. But the drama isn't quite over. Enter stage right, American lawyer Michael Garcia, FIFA's independent ethics investigator, the man who carried out that 2-year investigation into the World Cup bids. He says that the German adjudicator's summary is full of mistakes and resigns in protest. The drama has turned to farce. And instead of closure, a question. What would it take to reform football's governing body? Or, in short, who can fix FIFA?
Part 1. The sponsors.
Our first expert witness is Sue Bridgewater, Director of Sport at Liverpool University.
I'm having a very stressful few weeks.
Her football team is facing relegation. It's the intensely emotional experience of being a football fan, and it's this connection to the game that draws in FIFA's sponsors and broadcasters.
Football is a global sport. It has immense following and very strong emotional engagement with its fans. It is increasingly difficult for marketers to actually get their message across. Current generations are rather bored with advertising, and we've all got very good in the digital age of skipping adverts. So they have to find other ways of communicating their messages. Sponsorship is a good one, not least because the younger male audience is notoriously difficult for marketers to actually get in touch with.
A willing audience of football fans, pumped up with emotion, with as many as 1 billion of them watching the big games. It's why sponsorship now makes up around 1/4 of FIFA's revenue for the World Cup, giving those sponsors great power.
For that reason, they have a voice, and they can use that voice to influence if they choose to use that voice to influence.
So FIFA sponsors could put pressure on FIFA to change. But do they want to?
Obviously, if you are sponsoring something where there's any possibility that what you're sponsoring could actually have a sort of negative halo effect on you rather than a positive one, you would be concerned about it as a sponsor.
We've seen that before, with Oscar Pistorius and Tiger Woods, who both lost sponsors. But are there any signs that FIFA sponsors are getting the jitters?
In the middle of last year, some of the sponsors actually made a statement saying, they wanted transparency in the voting processes for the World Cup. Then, at the end of last year, a number of sponsors didn't renew their deals with FIFA. Now, the biggest concern really is the top-tier sponsors. There were 6 of those. They accounted for a fairly major proportion of the revenue to FIFA. Sony and Emirates did not continue their deals into the next World Cup cycle. And 3 of the next tier sponsors also discontinued their deals.
None of those sponsors has cited corruption as the reason for ending their contracts, but she says it's unlikely they'd say so even if it was. No one wants to be associated with scandal. Whatever the reasons, the actions of a few sponsors are unlikely to trouble FIFA.
There's already suggestions of others who may be prepared to step in their place.
The prize of a World Cup audience is just too great to pass up. There will always be other companies ready to stump up the cash. Broadcasters, too, are unlikely to walk away.
If you are a commercial broadcaster, then the advertising that might be associated with showing those matches are going to be very big draws for broadcasters. It will be a very bold decision to actually not be involved in a World Cup tournament as a broadcaster.
So, could sponsors force FIFA to change? Yes, they could. But will they? Unlikely. Next up?
Part 2. The Confederations.
UEFA undoubtedly have the power to influence FIFA, but to do so, frankly, they would have to consider withdrawing from the World Cup. It sounds drastic, but frankly, this has gone on for years now.
That's David Bernstein, former head of England's Football Association. Others have made similar points, that UEFA, the body that governs European football and the most powerful of the regional confederations within FIFA, could force FIFA to change. Here's our second expert witness.
In the home of FIFA in Zurich, where the executive committee meets, is a bit like, one of those places where James Bond movie villains used to plot the world from, in a big bunker.
This is Alan Tomlinson from the University of Brighton, a man who's dedicated his career to writing about FIFA. Does he think UEFA could influence FIFA by breaking away?
I could imagine it causing a tremor in the bunker of the FIFA Executive Committee. The FIFA, without the most revered individual players and the most glamorous and rich clubs in the world, would just not be able to make the same sorts of claims about what it represents. There would be fights over player availability. I mean, it would be a traumatic split.
With all of Europe's star clubs and players, he says UEFA could create an alternative league.
It happened to cricket in the 1970s when the Australian Kerry Packer formed his own alternative commercial tournament and league, and it seduced all the top players into it. It took a few years for that to be ironed out and a single body to arrive.
Walk me through the process by which UEFA could leave FIFA.
UEFA could seek to mobilise its members. It could say, look, UEFA has a serious product itself, the Champions League. A lot of the members of UEFA have the top national leagues, top 4 or 5 in the world. We could leave and set up some alternative. But what it couldn't do is it couldn't rival the magic of a full World Cup. And the history and the romance of the World Cup since 1930 would be torn to shreds on that model. But UEFA could, if it were absolutely serious, pull out.
And isn't that the key question, though, that talk of pulling out only creates pressure on FIFA if it's seen as credible and plausible? Is it?
Well, there aren't, as far as I've heard, there aren't any serious voices around or within UEFA committed to that prospect. It's more likely that what UEFA really wants to do is find someone from within its own makeup to get into the top at FIFA.
Not so much a pullout then, as a desire to take over. And with Sepp Blatter likely to be in the driving seat for the next 4 years at least, reforming FIFA by controlling the presidency is a long-term goal. If the confederations are hoping to push for reform by threatening to pull out, they'll have to make that threat look more convincing. So could the confederations push FIFA to reform? They could. Will they? Probably not. So what about pressure a little closer to home?
Part 3. The Swiss Roll.
Clean up your house, Mr. Blatter. Why
This
don't
is
you
an
want
open
to-
letter written to Sepp Blatter 4 years ago by Swiss MP Roland Berkil.
Are a risk to the reputation of Switzerland. ISL paid more than 100 million euros to senior officials in FIFA and IOC. FIFA and the other sports federations, they really became a harm to the reputation of my country. I was really fed up with that.
His mission to clean up FIFA began in 2001, before he became an MP, when the company that he worked for, ISL, a World Cup rights marketing agency, went bust. A few years later, a report from FIFA's own ethics adjudicator found that ISL had bribed some senior FIFA officials in return for securing lucrative TV deals. Roland Burkill had no knowledge of this at the time. It led to some big-name resignations in FIFA and a determination from the Swiss MP to clean up the organisation.
People thought that it would not be possible to change a sports federation, and people first were laughing at me because many of them didn't see the problem as big as it is.
So Roland Burkill set about persuading his fellow MPs to take the problems at FIFA more seriously.
FIFA is registered like a normal association. It's just the same status as a yodeling association in a mountain village. And that's not the correct way to be registered for a billion-dollar company. They are accountable in a much lighter way than a company of the same size would be. For example, they don't have to declare the salaries of the president. They don't have to say how much they spend, or they give in bonuses who gets how much money.
At the end of last year, he got enough support to help push through a new law, changing the status of sports officials in Switzerland. They're now politically exposed persons, which means
if, for example, a sports official puts 30,000 Swiss francs into his account in cash, this will have to be reported to the authorities. So it means that no bribery money will be directed through Switzerland anymore. They will have to find completely different ways of paying the bribes if they want to carry on with that.
There's a second piece of legislation up for debate in June, which he's even more excited about. If passed, it will make private corruption a criminal offence.
So the ISL case, for example, this 142 million paid in bribes, public prosecutor couldn't take any action because it was just not a criminal offence. This will mean that private corruption will become an official crime. And this means if the public prosecutor knows of a case, he will have to step in. So it will be a huge change in law and in the end in the behaviour of the sports officials.
How worried do you think FIFA is about these new laws in Switzerland?
I think they're quite worried because they have now really started to do extremely strong lobbying actions. 3-4 years ago, they were quite amateurish. As a reaction to the open letter I wrote to them, they invited 246 people to have a lunch.
Who were these 246 people?
The 246 people are all members of parliament of the two chambers.
That's a big lunch.
It would have been a big lunch, but the success was tiny. Only 10 people turned up, and I just told them, please next time just organize a football game so we'll get at least 11 people. and in the end they even organized a football game, but it was on a small pitch, so it was only 6 against 6.
Now, 4 years later, they've learnt their lesson. It's not just lunches and football matches, they're taking a more direct approach.
They have their own people lobbying in parliament. They really try hard and with a lot of money to have an influence on parliament.
And do you think they'll be successful?
No.
So this is a big change.
I think it was a big turning point, and I'm even convinced that it is important for FIFA because change must come with pressure from the outside. Mr. Blatter just hasn't changed enough, and now with this pressure from the outside, he must change things, and I'm absolutely convinced that this helps football.
So who can fix FIFA? Sponsors could put pressure on FIFA, but most don't want to. The federations could pull out, but they probably won't. The Swiss are beginning to apply pressure, but it's slow progress. So who else could fix it? There's one place we haven't looked yet: FIFA itself.
Part 4. An inside job.
One of the association heads walks up to me and says to me, "You're a bloody idiot." I was astonished first.
Meet our final expert witness, Marc Piet, a Swiss law professor who's had to get used to being unpopular. For 2 decades, he was chairman of the OECD Working Group on Bribery, where he pushed every country in the Western world to develop anti-bribery laws. 2 years ago, he took on a new challenge, trying to reform FIFA from the inside. Were you quite intimidated by the size of the challenge?
Frankly, not really. It was probably the other way around. I underestimated the challenge. We were caught up in a lot of infighting, and most of them are happy to reform on paper, but to actually change their attitude, that's a different matter.
What he wanted to change was FIFA's attitude to regulation.
They're no different from the United Nations or the Vatican. They have above them the clear sky. Nobody is there to supervise them, and they do exactly what they think is right.
As chairman of FIFA's new independent governance committee, he decided to create what FIFA had never had before, an ethics committee. It has two separate chambers, an investigative arm led by a prosecutor and a judicial one led by a judge. The problem is, as we heard at the start of this inquiry, the prosecutor has fallen out with the judge.
They were too independent. They were doing exactly what they thought was right, and they were acting like loose cannons. They had a cross-cultural difficulty. You have, on the one hand, a very politically thinking US ex-attorney, and on the other hand, you have a very straight Bavarian judge. And the two just didn't harmonize.
Despite the cultural challenges, he stands by his ethics committee. And he's also rather proud of the new Audit and Compliance Committee, staffed with two outsiders.
They can walk into every room, open every cupboard, they walk into every committee, and it's much more difficult to simply shift packages of money around.
But how much of that corruption is really on plain view in the first place?
Well, of course, there are some very, very blatant aspects. In 2011, you had people who were ready simply to sell their votes. Now, there are much, much more elaborate ways of patronage, and this integrity committee has actually, over time, found out that some of the old hands had been taking millions, and they had to leave.
He's referring to the ISL bribery scandal we heard about earlier. It's evidence of his new committee's inaction, he says, doing the job he wanted them to. But that's about as far as he got with FIFA reforms. Then the resistance started.
They realized that things were getting serious. When we started talking terms of office or integrity checks for newcomers, then they started balking.
They also balked at his suggestion that they publish executive pay.
They would have to stand up and say, I have nothing to hide. It's about transparency. And by the way, I'm starting with myself. And I had actually suggested this to Mr. Blatter, the president of FIFA, to say, why don't you shock all your critics? Stand up and say, what's the big fuss about? I'm earning this or that. And he said, well, it's not a bad idea, but frankly, I don't want to do this alone. I would like to do it together with the entire executive committee. So it's like standing around the swimming pool and nobody dares to jump in.
What sense did you get of his desire to change FIFA from the top?
Well, you know, that's a difficult one. I asked him that question at the very beginning. Why are you doing this? You've been living happily before. And he said, well, I want to leave the house through the front door. I would have respected it if he had left. But somehow running again now counteracts what he's been saying.
He sees Sepp Blatter's decision to run for a fifth term as epitomising the problems at the heart of FIFA.
People are afraid of losing power.
So what does FIFA say? We put in a call to Walter de Gregorio, FIFA's Director of Communications.
I think in the last 4 years we tried really to strengthen and to improve good governance. I think the biggest achievement for sure was this ethics committee, the two chambers of the ethics committee.
Central integrity checks would have been
a good idea,
even though they weren't implemented. But, he says, most of the Independent Governance Committee's proposals have been adopted.
I think there were about 40 recommendations from the IGC. Most of them, I think 37 or 38, were accepted. The reform process was a hard process. It was a process that did hurt, for sure, but it is a process that is necessary and a process that has to go on.
And here's what he said about publishing pay.
In Switzerland, it's a different mentality. If you live in the US, after the first or the second coffee, you tell what you make a year. In Switzerland, people see this is something private. People don't talk about their salaries.
But FIFA is, after all, an international organisation. Not everyone can claim Swiss sensitivities.
Yeah, I understand. Maybe I'm the wrong guy, because I would be very honoured to tell you how much I make, because I think I earn every penny.
So just how much does he make?
Well, I can't tell you, because it's also solidarity. I cannot be the first one who tells you how much I make.
It's back to that swimming pool. No one wants to be the first to jump in. So who can fix FIFA? As we've heard in this inquiry, the sponsors, federations and broadcasters all have the power to push FIFA to reform, but they don't want to lose out on the benefits FIFA brings. So who has the will to fix FIFA? The Swiss are beginning to make life more difficult for the organisation, but it's becoming clear that radical change can only come from one place.
The will to reform FIFA has to come from within FIFA.
The change must come from within FIFA, that's absolutely clear.
And not just from anywhere inside FIFA, from one place in particular.
It would have to have a new president to change.
So that's who will fix FIFA. A knight in shining armour who will ride into the presidency and set about cleaning the place up. But Walter de Gregorio isn't so sure.
You have a structural problem where you have the president elected by one body, namely the Congress, and you have his ministers, like his government, elected by another body, namely by 6 different confederations. So basically, his government, his group of people representing the interests of their own confederation. So you tell me now how a president has to deal with that.
Over the past 100 years, FIFA has turned from a small charity into a Byzantine empire, much like its multi-level headquarters in Zurich, with layer upon layer of associations, confederations and committees, all rewarded with loyalty. That knight in shining armour is likely to find themselves blocked at many turns. So who can fix FIFA? For the foreseeable future, maybe no one.
This edition of The Inquiry was presented by Helena Merriman and produced in London by Phoebe Keane and me, Simon Mabin. If you've got something you want us to investigate, demand an inquiry on the World Service Facebook page or on Twitter. We're at BBC The Inquiry.